Snow falls softly over the quiet hills of the Ardennes, drifting through the frozen air like pale feathers searching for a place to rest. The wind moves slowly between the trees, brushing against the branches with a gentle whisper, as if the forest itself is holding its breath. In the distance, beneath that cold white sky, a small ridge rises above the village of Lanzerath. It is calm now, peaceful, almost untouched. But on one December morning in 1944, this silence would be broken by footsteps, gunfire, and the heavy weight of fate. For on this ridge, 18 young American soldiers, tired, cold, and far from home, found themselves staring at the approaching shadows of an army 500 strong. An army trained, armed, and determined. An army sent by Germany with one purpose: break through the American lines and change the direction of the war. No one expected a fight here. Not the American commanders who believed this area was quiet and safe. Not the German officers who assumed they would sweep through without resistance. And certainly not the 18 members of an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon who were never meant to hold a frontline position at all. Yet history is full of moments when ordinary people, placed in extraordinary circumstances, create a story no one could have predicted. Perhaps it begins with fear. Perhaps it begins with duty. Or perhaps it begins with the simple understanding that sometimes, even without orders, even without certainty, you must stand where you are and refuse to move. On this cold morning, the men on the ridge had no idea how many enemies waited beyond the trees. They only knew that something was coming. A sound carried through the forest, boots crunching on snow, low voices speaking German, the soft clatter of metal and gear. Every minute the sounds grew louder, closer, more organized. The ridge felt smaller with each breath. Imagine the smell of cold iron in the air, the sting of frozen wind on the skin, the hard grip of a rifle that felt heavier with every passing hour. 18 men spread along a shallow defensive line, looking out into a forest filled with white fog and phantoms. Their hearts beating in quiet rhythm with the land beneath them. They had dug shallow foxholes in the frozen ground. Their gloves were wet. Their faces were numb. Their breath rose in small clouds as they watched the tree line, waiting for shapes to appear. Behind them, the village lay silent. Ahead of them, unseen but undeniable, the German attack prepared to move. Perhaps some of the men thought about home, about warm kitchens, laughter, light, about a world far from this ridge. Perhaps others thought only about survival, calculating angles, distances, the limited ammunition they carried. And maybe, just maybe, a few of them wondered if today would be the last page of their story. But fate had chosen this place, this ridge, these 18 men. And as the first German soldiers stepped out from the shadowed forest, their uniforms dark against the white snow, the Americans knew the truth. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmatched. Yet something inside them refused to break. Something simple, quiet, and strong. The wind paused. The world held still. And with a single shot, the kind of shot that echoes not only through trees but through years, the battle for Lanzerath Ridge began. The Ardennes in winter is a place that feels carved from ice and memory. Tall trees stand like silent guards over the land, their trunks dark against the endless white. Snow hangs on their branches in heavy layers, bending them with the weight of the season. The wind carries the smell of pine and frozen earth, drifting through narrow valleys and across the high ridges that shape the terrain. 4 miles, the land rises and falls in gentle waves, a quiet landscape that hides danger beneath its calm surface. In December 1944, this region seemed peaceful. Many American soldiers believed it was a safe sector, almost a resting place compared to the brutal fighting in other parts of Europe. The front line here was thin, held by units that were stretched, tired, and not prepared for a major attack. The roads were narrow, the villages small, and the forests thick enough to swallow an entire army. But beneath this quiet cover, Germany was preparing something immense. As the snow deepened, German high command gathered thousands of troops, tanks, and artillery in the shadows of the woods. Their plan was ambitious: launch a surprise winter offensive, break through the American lines, and push all the way to the port of Antwerp. It was a gamble built on secrecy and speed. If successful, it could split the Allied forces and prolong the war. If it failed, it would drain the last strength Germany had left. The men on Lanzerath Ridge did not know the full scale of this plan. They did not see the columns of vehicles hidden in the forests, nor the long lines of soldiers marching under cover of fog. They did not know about the maps spread across German tables, or the whispered orders passed from officer to officer. What they saw was simple: a forest, a ridge, a village behind them, and an uneasy quiet that made the hair on the back of the neck rise. To understand the weight of what would happen, you must understand the land itself. Lanzerath was a small village, almost too small to appear on some maps. A few houses, a church, narrow lanes covered in snow. The ridge beside it overlooked the main road, a road the Germans needed to capture quickly if they were to keep to their timetable. The elevation gave anyone positioned there a clear view of the valley below, making it an ideal defensive point. But no one expected a defense here. So no one reinforced it. No artillery. No extra infantry. No heavy weapons. Just 18 men. They were part of an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon, scouts, not frontline fighters. Their job was to observe, gather information, and report enemy movement. They were trained to move quietly, think quickly, and fight only when necessary. Holding off a battalion was not in their orders. It wasn't even imagined. The cold that morning had a sharpness that could cut through layers of clothing. Breath turned to frost on scarves and helmets. Boots sunk into snow that cracked under every step. Even the sound of a twig snapping felt louder than it should. And as the Americans took their positions along the ridge, the world seemed to narrow to the space between the trees, to the horizon where the first signs of movement might appear. Each man carried a rifle or carbine. A few had machine guns. Their ammunition was limited. Their food was low. Their communications were unreliable. Yet they settled into their foxholes with a quiet resolve. They had been here for days, watching, listening, waiting for something they could not yet name. If you listened closely that morning, you might have heard distant echoes, soft, muffled sounds that carried faintly through the trees. The rumble of trucks. The crunch of many boots. The metallic clatter of gear being adjusted. A force gathering strength and direction. The men felt it before they fully understood it. A change in the air. A tension that spread like a shadow across the ridge. They exchanged glances, brief, silent, and filled with unspoken questions. In the distance, beyond the layer of fog that clung to the forest floor, dark shapes began to move. Slowly at first, like ghosts forming from the cold air, then gradually taking the shape of men, many men, marching in tight formations. Their uniforms blended with the forest, their steps steady and coordinated. They carried rifles, machine guns, and mortars. Officers walked among them, pointing, signaling, preparing. The Germans had arrived. From the ridge, the Americans watched the scene unfold with a mix of disbelief and rising fear. 18 against hundreds. A mismatch so extreme it almost felt unreal. But this was no drill, no exercise, no miscalculation. It was the beginning of a storm. Lanzerath Ridge was never meant to be the site of a stand. It was simply where these men happened to be on the day the largest German offensive in the West began. But sometimes fate places people in positions they did not choose, with tasks they never expected, and courage they did not know they possessed. The forest grew darker as clouds thickened overhead. Snow swirled in the wind, drifting across the ridge in small spirals. The men tightened their grips on their weapons. Hearts raced. Breath came faster. Time seemed to slow, stretching each second into something heavy and long. The Germans were now close enough to see clearly. Columns of soldiers moved with discipline and purpose. Their boots rose and fell in unison. Their helmets glinted faintly in the pale winter light. An officer raised a pair of binoculars, scanning the ridge with quick, practiced movements. Did he see the foxholes? Did he sense the danger? Or did he believe the ridge was empty like many others did? The Americans waited. No one spoke. No one moved. Their fingers rested on triggers. Their eyes followed every motion in the forest below. One of them might have whispered a silent prayer. Another might have clenched his jaw, pushing down fear. Another might have thought of home, imagining for a brief second the warmth of a kitchen or the soft murmur of a familiar voice. But all these thoughts faded the moment the German vanguard stepped past the final line of trees. The moment the snow around them shifted under dozens of boots. The moment their formation opened slightly as they prepared to advance toward the village. The ridge held its breath. And in that held breath, the fate of an entire division, maybe even the fate of the offensive, hung suspended, waiting for one spark to ignite the fire that would shape the next hours. The spark was coming. And the men on the ridge could feel it. The snow kept falling as the German soldiers spread out at the base of the ridge, unaware that eyes were watching them from above. The morning light was dim, softened by thick clouds that dulled the colors of the forest. Everything felt muted except the tension rising in the air. It stretched across the landscape like a thin wire ready to snap. To the Americans, what they were seeing did not make sense at first. Why so many troops here? Why this road? Why this valley? Their orders had not warned of an attack. Their commanders believed that the enemy across from them was weak and scattered. Yet the scene below told a different story, one of discipline, preparation, and strength. Something larger was unfolding. To understand what was happening at that moment, you must go back to the strategy taking shape inside German headquarters. In the final months of 1944, Adolf Hitler knew Germany was losing the war. Supplies were low, fuel was scarce, and Allied bombers controlled the sky. But Hitler believed that one bold strike could change everything. One sudden offensive could shatter the Allied front, split their armies, and force negotiations. This idea became the Battle of the Bulge. The plan was daring. German forces would gather secretly in the Ardennes forest, where Allied intelligence was weakest. They would launch a surprise attack through the snowy hills, using the poor weather to hide their movements from the air. They would break through the thin American lines and drive west to Antwerp, a port city vital to Allied supply. If they reached it, the war might shift, or so the German leadership hoped. The soldiers gathering below Lanzerath Ridge were part of this massive effort. They belonged to one of Germany's elite units, trained for rapid movement and powerful strikes. Their orders were clear: push forward without delay, break through the American defenses, and open the road for the armored columns behind them. Every hour mattered. Every mile was part of a tight timetable. But no one had told them about the American scouts watching from the ridge. They expected little resistance. They prepared for a quick victory. Up on the ridge, Lieutenant Lyle Bouck, the leader of the American platoon, studied the approaching force with disbelief. He was young, just 20 years old, but responsible for the lives of his men. He knew they were lightly armed, carrying only what a small reconnaissance unit could manage. He knew their foxholes were shallow and the ground beneath them frozen solid. He knew their radios barely worked. And he understood, with growing clarity, that they were facing far more than a patrol or a small advance party. He was facing an entire battalion. Still, Bouck did not panic. He whispered instructions to his men, signaling for silence and discipline. They had the advantage of elevation. They had the advantage of surprise. If they fired too early, the Germans would take cover. If they fired too late, they would be overwhelmed. Timing was everything. From their foxholes, the Americans could see the expressions on some of the German soldiers: tired, cold, focused. Many were young, not much different from the men on the ridge. War had brought them together in this frozen corner of Europe, each side carrying hopes, fears, and burdens far heavier than their gear. A gust of wind swept across the ridge, carrying fine snowflakes that dissolved on warm skin and melted along the edges of rifles. The smell of pine drifted through the air, mixed with the faint scent of oil and metal from the weapons. The forest creaked softly as if struggling under the weight of winter. The Germans halted near the base of the ridge. Officers shouted brief commands. Soldiers adjusted straps, checked ammunition, scanned the terrain. They were preparing to move toward the village of Lanzerath. To reach it, they would have to cross the open slope leading up the ridge, an incline that exposed them, however slightly, to whoever might be watching. The Americans' hearts beat faster. Their fingers tightened on triggers. Their breath turned shallow. One man, positioned behind a machine gun, steadied the weapon with slow, careful movements. The barrel pointed down the slope like a warning waiting to be given. Another soldier looked through the scope of his rifle, tracking the German officer who seemed to be directing the troops. He exhaled slowly, letting the cold air pass over his lips in a thin stream. The Germans began to advance. It started with a few steps. Crunching snow. The shifting of weight. Then more. Rows of soldiers moving in coordination, marching toward the incline with confidence. There was no hint in their posture that danger waited ahead. No sign that they suspected 18 Americans lay hidden on the ridge. Perhaps this was the moment when the Americans understood fully what was at stake. If they let the Germans pass, the road behind them would fall. The villages behind them would fall. The entire American line in this sector could collapse. And if that happened, the German timetable would remain intact. Their tanks, waiting behind the infantry, would pour through the breach. What stood between that breakthrough and delay that could save thousands of lives, were 18 men. Snow brushed softly against their helmets. Their breaths came out in uneven pulses. Time slowed. The world seemed to pause at the edge of something irreversible. Then someone whispered 2 words. Wait, now. The first shot cracked through the air, sharp and sudden, echoing through the trees. A German soldier fell. Confusion rippled through the formation. Another shot rang out. Then a third. And suddenly the ridge erupted. Machine guns roared. Rifles cracked. Snow burst from the ground in small white explosions. German soldiers dropped to their knees, scrambling for cover. Officers shouted orders. Chaos broke the neat formations that had moments before moved with precision. The Germans had walked into a storm they never expected. The Americans, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with a fierce determination that came not from confidence, but from necessity. They knew they could not win outright, but they could slow the enemy. They could force them to scatter, to hesitate, to lose precious time. Every second mattered. Every burst of fire mattered. Every decision made on that ridge carried weight far beyond the snow-covered ground beneath their boots. And as the battle exploded into motion, the true test of those 18 men, the test that would echo through history, had finally begun. The firefight on the ridge did not last as a neat, contained exchange. It spread and folded, a living thing that moved with the instincts of those who fired and those who were hit. Small pockets of smoke rose where rounds struck earth or wood. The air filled with the smell of cordite and wet wool. Shouts in German mixed with low, clipped English. Bodies moved, fell, rose. Men crawled, dragged, and shouted over the roar. Time fractured into moments measured by bursts of gunfire and the hollow count of a magazine emptied. To understand how those moments fit into the larger picture, we must follow the map of men and machines that night and the hours that followed. On the German side, the offensive, called Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein in their planning rooms, was a vast orchestration. It placed 3 army groups in motion, each with divisions and regiments assigned a role. Fast-moving armored spearheads would drive through seams in the Allied lines while infantry secured the flanks and held captured ground. Radios hummed in trucks. Orders were given and received. Men were moved into position under strict timetables. The success of the whole plan depended on momentum and surprise. Lanzerath Ridge lay directly on one of the minor arteries the Germans hoped to seize and clear. Its overlook on the road made it a choke point not in the mind of planners but in the brutal reality of terrain. When 18 Americans opened fire, they did not stop a division with a single volley. They did something perhaps more consequential. They stopped a timetable. They forced officers to pause, to assess, to reorganize. Those pauses, measured in minutes at first, then in hours, began to pile up, and in war, hours are the currency of success. The Americans were not a single, perfectly drilled unit performing a textbook defense. They were a ragged, determined group of young men, each carrying a life story compressed into a small weight of gear. Some were fresh from training, some hardened by weeks in Europe, some simply exhausted. Their weapons were standard issue. M1 Garens, bars, a Browning automatic rifle here and there, a captured German machine gun perhaps used in a pinch, a few Thompson submachine guns, and a singular, stubborn willingness to aim steady. Their ammunition belts were finite. Their rations were sparse. Their radios, when they functioned, crackled with static. Lieutenant Bauch and his men used what the terrain offered. They saw gaps and flanks, small hollows where fire could be concentrated. They shifted positions quietly between shots. They conserved ammunition, firing short, accurate bursts where a sweep might have been wasted. They aimed for officers and machine gun crews first, because stopping a leader or silencing a crew slows an advance faster than wounding a private in line. The men understood micro-tactics without fanfare. The best defense in that moment was precision and patience. German units, trained for offense and steeped in discipline, were not prepared for this level of resistance on such a shallow front. Their formations had to break, to move from organized columns into crouched skirmishers, to find cover behind hedges, farm walls, and trees. Mortars began to speak from the rear, seeking to suppress the ridge, but mortar fire is an imprecise instrument in tight forest and freezing wind. It took time to zero in. Tanks, waiting on flanks and behind infantry, could not simply roll up the slope without sight lines and without risking anti-tank shots from hidden positions. Every minute the Germans hesitated, adjusted, or reorganized, the American timetable for the broader offensive lost a fraction of its advantage. Within that confusion there were small acts that mattered. A soldier on the ridge, confronting a machine gun nest, might slither forward and throw a grenade. A German squad, seeing its flank threatened, might pull back to cover. Documents later noted that groups that should have moved with the swift insistence of a plan instead found themselves in fragmented puddles of combat. Intelligence reports from both sides, reconstructed after the war, would show how these deviations compound. The offensive didn't need every unit to move flawlessly, it needed enough to hold a rhythm. Lanzerath Ridge introduced a discordant note into that rhythm. As the hours passed, daylight shifted into a gray that held no warmth. Snow continued to fall in patient, steady sheets. Scattered fires glowed in the village as homes burned or stoves tried to keep men from freezing. The Americans on the ridge counted each moment not in seconds but in rounds remaining, in breaths saved, in wounded men moved to less exposed ground. One by one, men experienced the physical consequences of the stand. Frozen hands numbed to the touch, blood that darkened the snow and then began to freeze, boots that had lost their soles to ice and rock. Wounds became colder, heavier. Exposure itself was an enemy. The fighting created small, private dramas. A medic moving under fire to reach a man whose leg had been shattered. A radio operator creeping to a higher point to try to call for guidance only to receive static and then a curt message that no help could be sent. The Americans on the ridge were not isolated in perception alone, they were isolated in supply. The platoon's mission had never included holding a road. Communication up the chain of command was intermittent. Orders did not arrive with batteries included. Yet they held, not because of paperwork or doctrine, but because human beings in front of them stayed present in the moment and kept choosing to act. On the German side, leaders grew impatient. The clock timetable was slipping. Radio transmissions carried terse demands for speed and reports about unexpected resistance. Units that should have flowed were now consumed in localized fights. Some German soldiers reported being surprised by the tenacity and precision of their opponents, noting later in interviews that many of the Americans fought like men defending not only position but honor. Across that battlefield, ordinary training confronted the unpredictable result of human determination. As the day wore on, both sides paid for their errors. Men were lost. Those who survived carried new, immediate knowledge. War is not made of plans but of human reactions to the plan. A battalion's purpose becomes a series of choices made under stress. Lanzerath Ridge exemplified this. A small group's decision to resist reshaped the operational tempo of the opposing force, and that rearrangement echoed up the chain of command. This stand also illuminated something enduring about war, the fog of decision. Commanders must make judgments with imperfect information. Those in command of the German push expected a quiet pass through this region. When confronted with resistance, they could call for reinforcements, request artillery, or attempt a flanking maneuver. Each choice consumed time and resources. Conversely, commanders on the Allied side did not have a single coordinated response ready for this particular hold. Instead, they benefited indirectly when German forces lost the exact momentum necessary for surprise. By dusk, the ridge had become a scar upon the landscape. The trees bowed under snow and the bodies of men seemed to sink into the white as though the earth were trying to hide its wounds. When the German advance eventually pushed through, when their numbers and firepower finally forced a collapse, the delay had already done its work. Vehicles that were meant to pass through without hindrance now moved through a chaotic, congested column. Armored units had to reroute. Commanders in higher echelons recalculated timetables. A well-orchestrated plan dependent on timing and movement had become less efficient, slower, and more vulnerable to the elements and to Allied countermeasures. In the weeks and months that followed, historians would trace the decisions and consequences back to moments like the stand on Lanzerath Ridge. They would point to the delay, minutes turned into hours, as a factor among many that contributed to the eventual failure of the German offensive. They would not claim that 18 men alone won a war, because war is a sum of many tragedies and triumphs. But they would argue that small, determined acts can unbalance even the most carefully constructed stratagems. A convoy delayed by an hour might avoid a blocking force. A tank rerouted might miss a minefield but be delayed enough for Allied aircraft to attack when the weather cleared. These are the indirect but decisive mechanics of battle. Not all consequences are immediate, and not all heroes get medals when history first rings out its verdicts. Some of the men captured at Lanzerath Ridge became prisoners of war and endured the further test of captivity, cold, hunger, the uncertainty of being alive and far from home. Others later returned to towns where names of their deeds were not yet carved into stone but remembered in quiet conversations between veterans. The official record took time to catch up with the human story. The ridge itself would remain for years, an unremarkable rise in the forest. Snow would fall again, leaves would return to branches and seasons would cycle. But for those who were there and for those who learned of it later, Lanzerath Ridge became a hinge in a larger narrative, a place where the fragile hinge of war held, then moved, then altered direction. Perhaps the most important lesson from those hours is not strategic alone. It is a lesson about the capacity of people, young, frightened, trained for small tasks, to meet an unforeseen demand and answer with a kind of quiet, stubborn courage. In the calculus of war, numbers and machines matter. But so do decisions, reactions, and the human refusal to surrender a place they believe they must hold. A subtle turning point came not with a trumpet or a dramatic charge, but with the slow, accumulating effect of delay. Minutes became hours. The timetable of the offensive, the beating heart of the German plan, faltered. And in that falter lay the seed of larger outcomes. There would be more battles in the Ardennes, more acts of valor and horror, more stories that historians would sift through for meaning. Yet the stand on that ridge, 18 men against 500, remains a vivid example of how small actions can echo far beyond their immediate field. It is a reminder that in the coldest, most mechanical machinery of war, human choice still has its say. If there is a quiet climax to this part of the story, it is the moment when the machinery of a large plan, intended to move like clockwork, is interrupted by the stubborn human element. That interruption does not always decide the final outcome. Sometimes it simply shifts the angle of the dividing line, granting time that can be used by others to respond, to reinforce, or to mount countermeasures. Time, in war, is a resource as precious as ammunition. And on Lanzerath Ridge, time was spent with price and purpose. When you consider the headlines and maps and the big movements of armies, it is tempting to forget these small nodes of resistance. Yet they accumulate. They complicate. They make history less predictable and, at times, kinder to those who wait for a chance to turn the tide. Pause and imagine the ridge now, a thin press of earth, snow gently falling, birds silent in winter. Under that quiet, stories sleep until someone remembers them. The men who fought there remembered and later told others. Their memories stitched into letters and interviews and documents became the threads historians would later follow back through the snow to find the shape of that day. If you listen closely in those records between the lines of tactics and charts, you hear human voices, awed, frightened, proud, regretful. These voices form the raw material of our understanding. They remind us that even in the vast, impersonal sweep of campaigns, individuals matter. They remind us that the fate of plans can turn on the decision of one man to shoot when he is told to, the choice of another to crawl forward and fetch a wounded comrade, the stubborn decision of a group to hold its cold ground until the world beyond them had changed. And so the story moves forward not as a finished book, but as a continuing narrative. The ridge held that day long enough to matter. The delay it caused rippled outward. What comes next is the human aftermath, the stories of capture, survival, and the slow unfolding of recognition. What comes next are the voices that speak of the experience not in maps and coordinates but in names, smells, and the feel of snow packed to the shape of a body. Continue to the next part and we will move into the intimate human perspective, letters, testimonies, memories, that transform the cold facts of battle into the warm, complicated truth of lived experience. When the firing finally faded and the ridge fell silent, the world did not return to calm. Silence after battle is never quiet. It is thick and uneven. It carries the echo of everything that came before and the weight of everything that has not yet begun. Snow continued to fall, settling on broken branches, empty shell casings, and the wounds of men who had fought until their strength collapsed. The Americans who survived the long hours of resistance were exhausted in ways that words rarely capture. Their hands shook from cold. Their eyes burned from smoke and tension. Muscles cramped from crouching in frozen foxholes. Some men were bleeding and did not realize it yet. Others were numb, their bodies running on instinct more than will. And beneath all of that, beneath the physical pain, lay a deeper heaviness, the realization that the stand was over, and that capture was now the only path left. German soldiers approached them slowly, cautiously, their weapons raised. The Americans did not resist. They could not. They had no ammunition. Some were too injured to stand. One by one, they lifted their hands or stepped forward with small movements, signaling surrender. War, in this moment, shifted from fury to helplessness. A German officer looked at the small group of prisoners and studied them with an expression somewhere between confusion and respect. Perhaps he expected to see a large force responsible for the delay. Perhaps he imagined a line of well-armed infantry. Instead, he saw 18 tired, frostbitten young men, some barely more than boys, who had held back his battalion for nearly an entire day. Later, one German soldier would recall staring at the Americans and whispering, "These few stopped us?" He did not say it with anger. He said it with disbelief. The Americans were marched from the ridge in a thin column, leaving behind the landscape where they had made their stand. As they walked, some glanced over their shoulders, looking once more at the small line of earth that had been their world for those intense hours. To others, it felt surreal, like stepping out of one life into another. Being a prisoner of war is not a single experience. It is a slow unfolding of fear, uncertainty, and endurance. For the men from Lanzerath Ridge, captivity began in the same frozen forest where they had fought. They were cold, hungry, and emotionally drained. German guards walked beside them, rifles at the ready, their breath forming pale clouds in the air. For some American soldiers, the march blurred into a long tunnel of white and gray. Snow fell on their shoulders and melted into their wounds. The pain of frostbite set in, first a sharp sting, then a slow numbness. Conversations among the prisoners were short, broken by shivering or by the need to concentrate on walking. Yet even in that bleak march, there were moments that revealed who they were. One soldier, limping from a leg wound, tried to hide his pain so others wouldn't worry. Another tore a strip of his own scarf to wrap around a friend's bleeding hand. Someone whispered a joke, weak but real, just to lighten the air. Small acts, almost invisible yet powerful. These were men who had fought together, suffered together, and now endured together. When they reached a temporary holding point, a barn near a German supply road, they were pushed inside and told to sit. The barn smelled of straw, wood, and animals. Light filtered in through cracks in the walls, cutting thin lines across their faces. A few German guards paced outside, stamping their feet to stay warm. Inside, the Americans finally allowed themselves to exhale. They removed helmets, rubbed their freezing hands, leaned against walls or collapsed onto the straw. Someone murmured, "It's over." Another whispered, "For now." No one spoke loudly. No one cried, although a few came close. In the dim quiet of that barn, their minds drifted. They thought of home, of meals they missed, of the warmth of kitchens, of letters they wished they had written. Some wondered if their families knew where they were. Others simply closed their eyes and tried to sleep, even though sleep would not come. Not every memory from that night was dark. There was a strange, fragile camaraderie even in captivity. One man shared the last of his chocolate ration. Another asked softly, "Did we do enough?" A simple question heavy with doubt. What none of them knew then, what none could have imagined, was that the hours they had bought on that ridge would ripple outward through the entire Battle of the Bulge. Behind them, far beyond the barn walls, American commanders were scrambling to react to the German offensive. Reinforcements began to move. Artillery units repositioned. Tanks warmed their engines. And those few hours of delay gave thousands of Allied soldiers the time they needed to prepare. But the men on the ridge did not think of strategy as they huddled in the barn. They did not think about maps, timetables, or division movements. They thought about surviving the night. They thought about what tomorrow might bring: interrogation, transport, perhaps a long winter in a prison camp. Some wondered if anyone would ever hear their story. 4 years after the war, many believed no one would. There were bigger battles, louder victories, and more famous stands. Lanzerath Ridge was a small place on a large front. Its significance was masked by the sheer scale of the battle that unfolded across the Ardennes. But history has a way of rediscovering the quiet acts of courage that shape its path. And the story of 18 Americans holding off 500 German troops would not stay hidden forever. The recognition would come later. Much later. But for now, on that night after the battle, they were simply young men trying to stay alive, holding on to hope like a fragile ember in the cold. Their journey was not over yet. The night settled heavily around the barn, the darkness pressing against its walls as if trying to seep through the cracks. The Germans had moved on, some marching toward the front, others taking their positions along the roads. The snow had swallowed most of the battlefield sounds, leaving only the distant rumble of engines and the occasional cry of a wounded soldier carried by the wind. Inside, the Americans shifted uncomfortably in the hay, trying to find warmth in a place that had none. A few had fallen asleep from exhaustion, drifting into shallow, uneasy dreams where gunfire and home collided in strange flashes. Others sat awake, staring at the wooden walls, replaying the battle in their minds. It was strange how silent the world felt now. Hours earlier they had been surrounded by noise, rifles cracking, machine guns roaring, voices shouting orders. Now every sound seemed too loud: the rustle of straw, the soft groan of a man shifting position, the slow breathing of tired lungs. One soldier whispered into the darkness, "Do you think anyone will believe us?" Someone answered quietly, "I don't know. Maybe." Another voice murmured, "We were supposed to observe, not fight a war." There was a pause, then a faint, tired laugh. "Well, we did more than observe." Their words drifted into the night, soft and broken. There were no speeches, no bold declarations of heroism. They did not see themselves as saviors or warriors. They were simply trying to understand how 18 scouts, men trained to watch, report, and withdraw, had become the only barrier between a German division and a vital road. In the days that followed, the prisoners were marched long distances through freezing countryside. Hunger gnawed at them. Their feet blistered. Frostbite stirred in toes and fingers. The guards were strict, sometimes harsh, sometimes indifferent. Yet even in that hardship, there were small moments of unexpected humanity. A German soldier handed one of the wounded Americans a piece of bread without being asked. Another guard allowed a prisoner to rest an extra minute before forcing the group to continue. War creates enemies, but it also creates strange, brief recognitions between men who understand suffering. As they moved deeper into German territory, the Americans tried to make sense of what had happened. Some replayed every shot fired, every decision made. Others tried not to think about it at all, afraid the memories would swallow them. But they all carried a question inside them, one they did not yet know how to answer. Had it mattered? They knew nothing of the chaos unfolding behind them. They did not know that German units were now delayed, that tanks were stuck behind infantry they had expected to sweep the ridge with ease. They did not know that American commanders, waking to the shock of the German offensive, now had precious hours to react because of their stand. When they reached a temporary POW camp, they were searched, counted, and placed inside a wooden enclosure surrounded by barbed wire. The cold bit into them. The nights were long. Food was scarce. Some guards shouted. Some ignored them completely. A few quietly expressed respect. One guard looked at them and shook his head as if he still could not believe it. Through a translator he said softly, "So few of you. So many of us. You must have been very stubborn." The Americans smiled weakly. It wasn't stubbornness, they thought. It was duty, and fear, and instinct, and maybe something else, something that only reveals itself when a person is pushed beyond what they believe they can endure. In later interviews after the war, several of the men described the strange mix of emotions they felt in captivity. There was shame for being captured, relief for being alive, fear for the future, and beneath it all, A quiet pride, small, warm, almost hidden, that they had held their ground as long as humanly possible. One soldier would write in his journal years later, "We fought because someone had to. I didn't think about medals. I didn't think about history. I just thought about the men next to me." That simple truth became the heartbeat of their story. Back on the battlefield, as the days passed, the consequences of their stand continued to grow. German units struggled to keep formation. Armored columns arrived late to key junctions. Fuel shortages worsened. And the carefully timed offensive began to lose its rhythm. Some historians describe the Battle of the Bulge as a race, one side trying to advance before the weather cleared and Allied aircraft returned to the skies, the other trying to slow the momentum long enough to regroup. In that race, hours mattered. Delays mattered. Unexpected resistance mattered. At Lanzerath Ridge, 18 Americans had created a delay that no German commander had planned for. They had not won a battle, but they had changed its timing. And timing in war can alter the shape of destiny. The men in the POW camp did not know any of this. They lived day to day, surviving as prisoners, sharing small stories, offering comfort when they could. Some prayed. Some planned what they would do if they made it home. Some simply held on to hope because letting go felt too heavy. One night, as they lay on wooden boards pretending to sleep, one soldier whispered into the darkness, "Do you think anyone will remember us?" Another answered, "Maybe not now. But someone will." He was right. Recognition took decades. Their stories slept beneath larger narratives, big offensives, famous generals, decisive victories. It waited quietly, like snow resting on a forgotten ridge. But history has a way of finding what matters even if it takes time. And when their story was finally brought to light, it shined with a clarity no battle smoke could hide. For now they endured. They hoped. They survived. And unknown to them, the road they had defended, even for a single day, helped change the course of the war. Long after the war ended, long after the snow on that ridge melted and flowed down into the valleys, long after the forest grew thick again, the world began to discover what had happened at Lanzerath. Time has a way of uncovering truths that were once buried. Archives open. Veterans speak. Historians dig. And slowly, stories that slept in silence rise back into the light. For many years, the men who fought on that ridge told almost no one about what they had done. Some mentioned fragments of the story in quiet conversations. Others wrote memories in notebooks that stayed in drawers. Most simply moved on with their lives. They returned home with the weight of war still inside them, but they rarely spoke of the battle that had pushed them to their limits. Maybe they believed it wasn't important enough. Maybe it felt too painful. Or maybe they simply believed no one would understand. But history often starts with a whisper. A question. A memory passed from one person to another. Someone hears it. Someone writes it down. Someone else begins to investigate. And slowly the world begins to see the shape of a story that would otherwise have faded into the quiet corners of time. Years after the war, researchers began to piece together the strange, remarkable truth. An entire German battalion, part of an elite force, had been delayed for nearly a full day by a single American reconnaissance platoon. 18 men against 500. A mismatch so extreme it almost defied logic. Interviews with German officers revealed confusion and frustration. Reports showed delays that rippled upward through the chain of command. Maps marked with arrows and timetables suddenly revealed gaps. Lost hours, stalled movements, changes of direction that were never planned. Those gaps pointed back again and again to the ridge above Lanzerath. The story began to take shape. A story of courage born from necessity, of fear turned into resistance, of young men doing what they believed they had to do even when every calculation said they could not succeed. When survivors of the platoon were contacted decades later, many were surprised. Some were shy about the attention. One of them remarked, almost embarrassed, "We were just doing our job." Another said softly, "I didn't think anyone would remember." But the more historians studied the battle, the clearer it became that the stand at Lanzerath was not a small footnote. It was a moment of extraordinary grit inside one of the largest battles America would fight in World War II. A moment where fate seemed balanced on the edge of a ridge, in the hands of 18 soldiers who never expected to be heroes. What makes their story powerful is not only the odds they faced. It is the very human question at its center. Why did they stay and fight when they could have slipped away? They had no orders to hold the ridge at all costs. They were scouts, not frontline infantry. They knew they were outnumbered. They knew help was not coming. And yet they did not retreat. Perhaps it was loyalty to one another. Perhaps it was the instinct to protect the road behind them. Perhaps it was the quiet courage that rises not from glory, but from responsibility. Every war has strategies, plans, and calculations. But the heart of war, the part that shapes history, is made of choices. Human choices made in the cold, in the dark, in the moments when a person must decide who they are and what they will do. On Lanzerath Ridge, 18 young men made that choice together. When these soldiers were finally recognized many years later, some were elderly, walking with slow steps or leaning on canes. Yet when they spoke of the ridge, their voices held a strength that time had not taken. They remembered the cold, the fear, the sound of snow breaking under the boots of the approaching enemy. They remembered each other. One of them said, "We weren't heroes. We were just kids who didn't want to give up." In that simple sentence lies the truth of many acts of courage in history. Heroism is rarely loud. It is rarely confident. It is often uncertain, quiet, full of fear. It is choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. It is holding a line not because you believe you will survive, but because something inside you whispers that you must. The ridge today is peaceful. A few stones mark the location. Trees stand tall where foxholes once lay. The wind moves through the branches with the same soft voice it had in 1944. Visitors walk the path quietly, reading plaques, imagining the snow, the fear, the young faces staring through scopes into a forest filled with danger. If you stand there long enough, you might feel it, the weight of what happened. The strange contrast between the calm of the present and the violence of the past. The echo of courage hidden in the stillness. This is the nature of memory. It lingers in the land. It rests in the stories passed down. It grows stronger each time someone learns what happened there. The story of Lanzerath Ridge teaches something timeless, that greatness can come from the most unexpected places, from people who never sought it. It teaches that small actions can shift the direction of events far larger than any one life. It teaches that even in the darkest winter, courage can rise like a spark and burn against the cold. And perhaps the most important lesson is this: history is shaped not only by generals, armies, and plans, but by ordinary people who choose to act when they are needed most. Those 18 Americans did not see themselves as heroes. But the world now knows what they did and what it meant. Their stand reminds us that courage is not measured by numbers or rank, but by resolve. It reminds us that the human spirit, even when afraid, can rise in ways that change the course of destiny. History is often told in large movements: arrows on maps, the rise and fall of nations, the sweep of armies across continents. But when you look closer, when you step beneath the surface of those grand events, you always find people. Individuals. Young, afraid, hopeful, determined. People who never expected to be written into history at all. Lanzerath Ridge is one of those places where human stories meet the weight of war. A place where 18 Americans were tested in ways they never imagined. A place where silence, snow, and courage combined to shape the direction of a battle far bigger than themselves. What happened there did not stop the German army entirely. It did not end the war. It did not make headlines in the days that followed. But it did something equally important. It bought time. Time for engineers to set up roadblocks. Time for reinforcements to move into position. Time for commanders to understand the scale of the attack and adapt. Time for the thin American line in the Ardennes to bend, but not break. War is often decided by such moments. Moments when the pace of an offensive slows just enough for the other side to breathe. Moments when hesitation, confusion, or resistance shifts the balance. Moments like Lanzerath Ridge, where courage creates the space for others to act. Years after the war, when survivors spoke about that day, their voices carried both pride and sorrow. Pride for what they had endured. Sorrow for what it had cost. They remembered the cold. They remembered the fear. They remembered the faces of friends beside them, some who survived, some who did not. But they rarely spoke of themselves as heroes. They spoke of duty. of doing what felt right in the moment, of not wanting to leave a gap in the line that others would have to pay for, of protecting each other, because sometimes courage is not about strategy at all, it is about the man in the foxhole next to you. In one interview many decades later, a veteran said softly, "We were afraid the whole time." Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing your job even when you're scared. These words hold the quiet truth of Lanzerath Ridge. And perhaps that truth extends beyond war. Perhaps it speaks to every moment in life when a person is called to stand their ground, when fear whispers that you are too small, too few, too weak, and yet something inside you insists that you must try anyway. There is a lesson in that ridge, hidden beneath the snow and the passing years. It tells us that strength is not always measured in numbers. It reminds us that the human spirit, when tested, can rise in unexpected ways. It shows that even the smallest stand can ripple outward, altering the movement of events far beyond what the eye can see. Today, if you walk the ridge, the forest seems peaceful. The wind moves gently through the trees. Birds rest on branches that once shook under the sound of gunfire. The earth where foxholes once lay has softened, covered by leaves and moss. But if you listen quietly, if you close your eyes and let the cold air touch your skin, you may feel a faint echo of the day when young men fought there with everything they had. Their story lives on not because it was grand or famous, but because it was human. Because it shows how ordinary people can rise to extraordinary moments. Because it reminds us that history is shaped by those who act, who endure, who refuse to give up even when the odds stand tall against them. As this story comes to its end, the ridge settles once more into silence. Snow drifts lightly over the ground, just as it did in 1944. The forest breathes slowly. And the echo of those 18 men lingers in the air, carried gently by the wind. Perhaps this is where it all leads, not to glory, not to triumph, but to understanding. Understanding that courage often comes quietly. That destiny can turn on the smallest hinge. That time given, even by a handful of people, can change the shape of a future. The ridge remains. The story remains. The memory remains. And in that memory, the voices of those 18 Americans still stand watch, young, cold, determined, holding the line for one more moment in time. The snow falls softly again, and history whispers their names.